Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallas. And today it's a pleasure to have a gentleman I met back in 2018 at a conference. I think Neil did I sign a book? Did you, was it a book? It was, okay, right.
I was fortunate to win. One of the tasks was to put a video together, so I won one of the SANS medals, and then basically I won one of your books and you signed it for me, and that's kind of where our relationship kind of started.
So, right, okay. Well, I hope the book has been of some use to you as a prize. Anyway, so everyone, this is Neil Frost, and Neil and I first met, like we just discussed, back in 2018, which seems a little while ago now. And Neil and I have stayed in contact since. And it's been really interesting to hear his story about how he's come from sort of non-cyber background, non-information security background, and how he's had to take that he's jumped up into a position responsible for education awareness, or more specifically behaviour and culture. And yeah, it's been an interesting journey for him. So I thought, it would be great to get him on the show, get him to share some of the insights, some experiences that he's had. And so, Neil, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, where you come from? I think, if I remember rightly, you worked, prior to your current position, you worked in the police, is that right?
So I was the head of operational safety unit for HM Customs. So it was very similar to police in their use of force training. So what they call the PST program, which is personal safety training, which is, for people who don't really realise what it is, it's the handcuffing and baton training, method of entry training for officers on the ground in operational teams.
Right. Okay. And so when did you make the jump into cybersecurity? I mean, one's sort of like physical security to a certain degree. I can sort of understand that, but then it's like, oh, let's go virtual. Yeah,
it was a strange decision at the time. It was purely a case of I was performing that role, but I was flitting around the country, sort of living out of a suitcase, delivering training or developing trainers, overseeing operational activity. But I was away from home so much, and my wife, she fell pregnant with our third child and basically said, I can't keep having you away from home all the time, which I completely understood. I went back to an operational role at the port of working for Border Force at the time. And then I saw a post with HMRC come up, which was to deliver culture, education, awareness. It was completely new, but I looked at the job description and it was very much, sort of hitting a lot of the same points of my previous job role, which I absolutely loved, and thought, I think there's going to be some commonality between, somebody putting handcuffs on somebody and, falling on the floor and hitting someone with a baton than it is actually, a cyber attack. And, it was a tough adjustment, but in many ways it's very similar type of work for me personally.
Okay. So what is it that you sort of see that in terms of the similarities between, the previous roles you had, which were all about training, and then the new role that you moved into within the context of cybersecurity, which was more focused on behaviour and culture? So one uses the phrase training, the other one was focusing on behaviour and culture. What did you see as the similarities?
Well, so with the Officer Safety program, when I moved into it, I was at a very junior level, and it was very good. It was, this is how we put handcuffs on somebody, this is how you restrain somebody, and it was all very good. But I took a project to look at use of force reports. So basically, effectively, you've got the training, in the dojo. It's a nice, safe environment. There's no stress level to it. And it was all going very swimmingly. Everybody goes away, they get their handcuff permit signed, and they're what we used to call ticketed for a year to obviously go operational. But I looked at use of force reports and looking at the type of injuries and incidents around when actual arrests were happening, and seeing the amount of head injuries that were happening as a common theme. And I thought, well, actually, on our training courses, we don't really do too much on the defence of somebody being hit around the head. And most of the use of force reports end up with multiple officers on the ground handcuffing somebody safely, but we used to do all our training one-to-one. So what we thought was, well, if real life is actually telling us this is what happens in reality, we should focus our training to replicate what's happening in the real world, so we can focus our training a little bit more. And we did a small project on it, and we discovered that actually by focusing on what the use of force reports are telling us when we deliver our training, and focusing our training a little bit more to what happens in the real world, which is human behaviour, we had a massive reduction in, I mentioned earlier about head injuries. We were seeing a lot of head injuries because, we were too busy focusing about, what would you do if you got hit? You go and restrain someone, but we weren't teaching officers very basic defence skills, how to defend from a punch, very basic gross motor skills as opposed to these highly technical skills. And
so the head, the injuries to the head that you were talking about were the injuries to the police officers' heads, to the officers' heads. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because we were looking at we talk about action or reaction and what's faster, and people go, well, the action's faster than reaction, and then we used to talk about being in action, and we followed a process and a system called the SPEAR system. It was an American guy called Tony Blauer who talked about flinch responses. When everybody's attacked, they flinch. And he talked about converting your natural human instinct, which is your flinch response, to protect yourself, as opposed to trying to override your natural flinch response with these skills that are taught in a dojo once a year. People are going to go back to what they naturally do, which is to put their arms up to protect themselves. So we look at that kind of thought process of how you convert your natural human reaction, which is your flinch response, into, I'm not going to say attack, because officers don't attack perpetrators, people that we're trying to arrest, restrain them. So that kind of similarity between, in culture, education, awareness, a lot of the compliance-based programs I look at, and they're very much right, let's tick the box, but they're not actually looking at what's happening in the real world. They're not not speaking to their CISOs, they're not speaking to the businesses, they're not speaking to the departments they're working to find out, well, what actually is happening, for us to have a little look at what our risk is, and let's tailor our training to suit specific audiences.
And I think what's interesting from that example that you've pulled out there is that there is training, and training's being delivered, but actually the training isn't actually the reflection of the real world that you've got. So I think that point about being trained one-to-one, when in fact the reality is that very rarely is it one-to-one. You've got multiple officers. So how does the training reflect the reality?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the case. And once we've done that, we actually saw a massive reduction in the amount of head injuries that officers were receiving, or serious injuries officers were receiving, because the training was focused. So we saw a reduction in the sort of injuries that we were seeing, obviously. And then if you replicate that across, well, that was purely based on focusing our training more, as opposed to going, well, we've covered everything over the 2 days of our training, so we can tick the box. Well, no, that's not the process that's actually saved your officers in, sometimes quite threatening situations, particularly talking about drawing a baton with knife attacks and things like that.
That sort of opportunity for improvement that you identified there, that stemmed from the reports which were being generated. I think what's interesting there is the training is not just about the results you get from training, it's about monitoring the broader context within which that training is applied, to see what information we can get, what data we can get from that, to better decide, to better drive, identifying opportunities for improvement there. So you got this metric that you were talking about in terms of use of force reports, and you're like, what is it that we can learn from these to better inform how the process of improvement on the training? And I guess the other thing that it highlights, and which I don't know what your view on this one is, maybe because you help as well, you can share your view. Training doesn't stop. Well, once you've got your training course. It doesn't just stay. It doesn't stay on the shelf and nothing happens to it. It needs to be improved, doesn't it?
Yeah, constantly. You need to look at, and where it replicates across to, what we do is, we have to find ways of personalising all culture, education, awareness training to the individual, wherever they work. That is the key to everything for me.
Yeah, but some people would say, I know that this was in the early days when I was doing research, it's going back 6-7 years now, that it's just not economical to personalize, training programs, communication programs, behavioral change programs, cultural change, taking into consideration, the fact, I've just moved to France, for example, and the difference between British culture and French culture is actually really, really stark. But we're probably thrown underneath one big umbrella. It's like, okay, it's sort of Western European culture. It's, well, actually, you really do need to get down to a more granular level. So have you come across the argument with, from business in particular, where they've said, look, I understand the need to personalize, but there's an economics problem we've got here, which is that we can't afford to.
Yeah, I think,
and personalize.
I think completely it is a huge problem. But I would say that if it isn't a case of being personalised, it's certainly being more focused with what you're delivering. So I find a lot of the natural instinct is to try and give everybody everything. And, you talk about, I know in your book, you talk about cognitive overload and things like that. So we overload people with loads of security messages. But being brave enough to actually strip back and go, do you know what? I don't think this group need this. So why do I want to hit them with this message when I can focus my message on something a little bit more key for that area? And that was kind of the point where I was talking about the personal safety program. It's actually a cutter crew on board a vessel looking for people smuggling drugs. They don't need to learn how to take somebody out of a Ford Capri car or a Ford Focus van. So we just cut from the program and spent more time on actually close quarters protection, going into a small room, a cabin. So focusing our training. So actually, I think the key for some of the industry is to actually go, do you know what, let's not overload everyone. Let's be brave enough to actually go, let's not actually deliver them that subject matter. Let's focus on
more. Yeah. Or in many aspects. Did you use the phrase Ford Capri car?
Yeah, I was going showing you there looking like.
I tell you what, I was like, I haven't heard of a Ford Capri car for a very long time. I remember the first time I saw a Ford Capri car, and I'm like, that is a cool looking car. It was back in the late 70s, I think. There we are, I'm showing my age now. Ford Capri car, I'm impressed.
Do you know what, Bruce? The thing is, I haven't heard the phrase Ford Capri car probably for about 20, 30 years, and I actually have no idea where that comes from. There might be a bit of behavioural insight into that. Maybe the stress of being on your podcast has caused me to go back to my childhood and act very childlike with what I'm saying. It could be that.
Anyway, off car makes. Yeah. So I think it was interesting because you used the phrase cognitive overload. Mm-hmm. And we can receive too much information. There is no doubt about that. And that's something else we're going to be covering with one of our guests actually in this particular series. But I think the simple option is just to train everybody on absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And it scales back to a certain degree the amount of administration and thinking you have to do and planning you have to do. Just give it to everybody. But it's worth the investment in terms of time in the planning to be able to identify the right training to go to the right people. But the one thing I have also seen, and we did some research a number of years ago, where actually you tend to get pushback from your target audience, so from employees, when they start saying, "Well, I don't, I'm sat down." And they're reluctant participants in many aspects.
Yeah.
But when they actually sit down and they get given training which isn't actually relevant to them, or you haven't explained its relevance to them.
Yeah.
But specifically, if they're a van driver rather than the Capri car driver, okay, they want the on the van and not the Capri, okay, and actually that then fosters a sense. It almost fosters a brand reputational problem. It's like, oh yeah, I remember this. I always get the training. The training isn't actually relevant to me, even though actually maybe a lot of it is. So the fact that some of it isn't, that actually tarnishes the brand reputation for the security training unit.
Yeah, I can imagine that being the case.
Yeah. So, thinking back to the challenges that you had when you sort of came, I guess, into cybersecurity, and even actually before that, what do you think are the main challenges to getting anything done in terms of investing in education and awareness? Is it just that people see it as a compliance exercise, or do you think that business stakeholders actually understand that if you get it done properly, it actually reduces your risk quite significantly.
I think the problem with it is, I think I found that we have people that really understand the issue and invest a lot in the human side of this space. But I think they've had a serious incident that's happened, whereas I think with others it may well be a case of convincing them because something hasn't happened yet, or I was listening to a podcast the other day about cybersecurity issues. Either a company's had a cybersecurity incident or they're going to have one, and then he actually changed that phrase to, or they haven't realised yet. And I think that's the problem. I think if they've had a serious breach or incident where it can be clearly shown as being a human error, then it's a lot easier sell than it is to somebody that says, well, we haven't had a breach, we don't have an issue. And, that pure, easy shortcut. And we talk about behaviours, and I know you talk about, people will always take the shortcut. I think, senior management, and quite rightly, because it's easier from an investment point of view, is to find a shortcut fix, which often shortcut fix usually technology, and that's what we're fighting against at times.
So we're sort of fighting against that shortcut, got to deliver something now type of mentality. And that's something that's come up in previous interviews I've done with people on the show as well. So, there's a phrase. I was having a chat with somebody, and I said, they would say, well, what would your title be? And I said, what's in the title? Do you think in any way that, when we label something education and awareness, we in effect basically just limit it to education and awareness?
Yeah, and naturally people will always just say education awareness, well, that's training. Everyone thinks it's training all the time. It's what people view it as, isn't it? Been at some of the conferences where we've met, and distinguishing the difference between education awareness and training is an important factor in when you're developing products or messages for the business. But it's getting the business to understand that, and ultimately the end user as well. They don't like feeling, particularly the space I'm working in at the minute, and with other government departments, is we sit within one department and then we're trying to replicate what we've done for that department in another. They feel like we're doing it to them, and we're training them, and that training fatigue kind of, they automatically go, well, we've got too much training on security, we don't want it, and you've got a blocker instantly, which is obviously going to cause a problem for delivery.
That's an interesting one, that they're doing it to them.
Yes.
And that basically then becomes a blocker. That they and is that do you actually involve them in the defining the needs and then coming up with, and this is how we're going to address that? Or is it a case that, in your experience, what tends to happen is, somebody comes along and they said, here's training on cybersecurity, you're mandated to do it. So I just trying to get a sense, because sometimes, it's almost like there's a push.
Yeah.
Okay. But then the audience to receive it are like, what's the reason for this? So I just wondered, in your experience, what worked better, or maybe it didn't work? The whole idea of spending time actually sitting down with the target audience for them, in effect, to define the business need for cybersecurity and then for training, or has it been in your case that it's just like, well, we've just got to deliver it, so we're delivering it?
Yeah, so we've come from a position with the government department I've been working for. We're quite mature in our culture, education, awareness space, but we're now onboarding other departments. And so the difficulty lies in, well, we've got products there ready for them, but, I talk about the blocker. They don't want them. They feel like it's being done to them. So we are going through that process at the minute of engaging them via trying to identify their risk by, going back to the classic survey approach. And I know some people love surveys, some people don't, but it's certainly a way for us to gauge from the off what sort of human element risk that they've got, to then establish what products we think they might need. And that process is working quite well with a number of departments that we're working to, because they accept that that their staff are telling them what what the errors are that they're seeing in the real world, so we can then tailor our obviously approach to it. But sometimes we are getting to the point where we're getting blocks from the off, and I think that's just more of a strategic problem with, you know, coming from a clustering approach, that, you know, some people want a cluster and some people don't, and it's just gradually getting people on board with it. And it's that approach of, let's start with small things and gradually get the momentum. And I know you talk in your book about sometimes it's, you know, best to try and get a small change first, and then they can lead to bigger changes. And I think that's, you know, doing that with surveys to start off with. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on surveys, whether they're a good or a bad thing.
Well, I think that they've definitely got a place, and it's really about trying to understand the you know, what's the objective of the survey.
Yeah.
And then, you know, often surveys are, just think about it within context from a marketing perspective. You know, if you wanted to get better quality data, so qualitative data as well as maybe quantitative data, and have deep dives to understand really what's going on, then usually something which in process is going to take considerably longer, and it's normally something that you do face to face, or maybe over the web or on a call. If you want large amounts of data, then maybe, you know, that's where people go to surveys. But there are people whose livelihood is designing surveys, because inherently we all have biases. You know, if we've got a clear objective in mind, then you may end up writing the survey in line with that specific objective, and you might actually introduce bias into that. Whereas if, for example, you define the business objective, but then you have somebody else actually write out the questionnaire, maybe that helps reduce some of the bias. Yeah,
I totally agree with you. Totally.
Yeah. And the other one is that if you're looking for quantitative data, okay, it doesn't necessarily always have to come from a survey. One of the interesting things about surveys is some people there is evidence that people will try and respond to a survey in line with what the expectations are.
Yeah.
And so, and it's great in a way, because you're like, wow, you know, people recognize what should be done, but what we really want is the real data, what is actually happening. And the one thing that I don't see a lot of when it comes to developing education and awareness strategy is a data strategy.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So designing, for me, awareness, behavior, culture strategy, you know, people that I've worked with, it's like saying, look, what you want to do is you want to drive continual improvement. That requires data.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your strategy for data? Now, I still haven't, in 7 years of looking very specifically at the human factor, but even going back further, the 13 years before that, where I've been working in cyber information security, and so I've experienced education and awareness, been a much less enlightened position, I think, as a result of not having done that research at the time. People don't design with data strategy in mind.
Right.
They don't have, okay, what information is it we're going to need to improve, and how are we going to design things in a way, create an information architecture that enables us to, you know, pull on that information. So it doesn't have to be a questionnaire. It could be just taking from the data strategy that you have, because really questionnaires about, let's get some data upon what the audience think.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, but if there's data already out there which isn't in a survey format, and overcomes the objections that people have to receiving more information and more survey requests, because there's a lot of surveying going on with employees, then it's a bit of a win situation.
Yeah, totally. No, I understand where you come from. I mean, it's just a difficult thing to get right, and, you know, especially when you've got large numbers.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think the thing with the large numbers is that it's about bearing that in mind when you design things. So, you know, one of the interesting things I looked at was a lot of what we do is drive people to an intranet, a corporate intranet, where there is a library of content regarding information security.
Yeah.
And one thing that we do is we actually look at the internet as it's just a website. It's an internal website.
Yeah.
And actually monitoring people's journey through the internet site is really interesting because, when I talk about behavior, one of the things I'm looking at is all the different aspects of behavior. So even drive somebody to the website, but then every time you get them to click somewhere else, that's another behavioral change. Totally
agree with you.
Yeah. So, but the website is designed to capture that information, so you can see the points of behavior where people have to make choices, and then you can design things to marginally improve the chance that they click on that to then move on to this next piece as well.
Yeah. No, I see that.
And I think that's where it's, in previous episodes and series, talking to people like Dan Arley, where we were talking about behavioral psychology, and then we've got Kendra McDonald, who is talking about designing email campaigns and websites with the user in mind. Quite a lot of my research is based upon what's called UX, or user experience. All these things help us to gather data and then to help help people go along that journey of engaging with the content and then influencing their behavior along the way.
Yeah, so, I agree. I mean, that kind of shows, one of the biggest things, and I think the blockers is we work really well with our comms teams. We've got corporate comms and internal comms, and they're really, really good people. But because they don't sit within our team, we find it really difficult to get them to change things to fit us, because we have to work with, corporate colours that don't necessarily fit with some of the strategies that we would like to implement with, for effective kind of delivery of our messaging.
Right.
And, our comms partners, our intranet sites, like you talk about, we get page hits, but we're not driving enough people to, we could put a newsroom article out to, we've got 68,000 staff in one of our departments, and, the average page hits for an article is about 7,000. So the reach isn't there. It's almost like we're transmitting, but there's no real feedback loop there, because 7,000 of 68,000 is just over 10%. It's just not, for all the work that you could do on a newsroom article, you're not getting the reach, are you? And that's about,
Interesting, though. From a direct marketing perspective, the 10% return on a campaign is actually quite respectable.
Is it? Oh,
it is.
I'll bear that in mind. Instead of us moaning about it, we'll be quite happy then.
Yeah, but it's as a marketer, we'll tell you that. I mean, they turn around and go, "That's great," and they say, "So how can we improve on that?"
Yeah,
and that's it. Out of interest, do you set yourself a target for actual clicks on the article?
Yeah, but I think a lot of that's been based on what we look for from our average over the years. So we're always looking to progressively improve it. I don't think we've put any real science to an actual target, but it was always looking for that 7,000 figure as an average. If we hit the average, we're happy.
Yeah.
Anything over that, we're really happy. But how it is human nature, the most page hits that an intranet site will get is if it's about pay, and that's how it is, isn't it?
Yeah, there are certain things which humans are drawn to, and I think that actually when you come to understand that, then the next point is, so how do I leverage that?
Yeah.
I mean, we here in the UK, in North America, in Europe, Australia, and a lot of countries nowadays, they have Security Awareness Month. And you can understand why, especially with those that are really struggling with budget, you can leverage that. But from a reaching out to an audience perspective, one of the things I gave some thought to on this was, what things might other people be interested in, and looking at actually what you've got on, what days you've got on, sort of like national days, and then developing campaigns around the national days, rather than around Education and Awareness Month.
Yeah, we do a lot of lock screen messaging around, Cyber Monday and Black Friday and Christmas and Easter. Yeah. We've even gone down to sort of the Halloween kind of approach, and even though it's not a British holiday, Thanksgiving and things like that. So we put some messaging around some of those days, because you're right, it does spike more interest.
Yeah, people are interested in that stuff rather than it's Education and Awareness Month. It's like, well, what are people actually interested in? Okay, or what are they more likely to be interested in? And then, leveraging that. So, it's great to hear that you've been doing that and that you've had some success with it as well.
Yeah, I think it's that classic case, and I don't want security professionals to dislike me, but security at times can be really boring. We have to be honest about that subject matter, not for people who are in the industry, because obviously they're in it for a reason, but we have to think of our end users. And as soon as you mention security, sometimes people do switch off. So it is about almost an indirect approach to the messaging, as opposed to coming out and saying, here's another security message.
Yeah, I wonder, because I remember seeing something on LinkedIn where somebody said, I think there was a picture at an event, there was a conversation going on, and they said, oh, security is boring. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, is security boring? Or is the way we're engaging with people about security not boring, but is that what's causing it?
Yeah.
I mean, there's certain aspects of security that when I get exposed to, and I'm like, I struggle to get excited about it because normally, if it's really technical, I'm really struggling to get excited about this. Just give me the top level, what it means for me as a user, for example.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think actually, I say it flippantly. Usually the exciting part of security is, like if we talk about phishing, it's actually having an understanding of what a hacker's doing. That's quite interesting from that point of view. But, the mechanics and the technical side of it is boring for people. So there's two sides of that, just that same thing, phishing, and it's about your messaging being about the stuff that people are going to find interesting, fun, and want to know about. It's about the technical side of things. And I think we're starting to leverage case studies a little bit more for leverage, because people literally love case studies. And the more and more on board with government departments we get, the more they want case studies, because it is a bit of an easy win for people. People like remember the story as opposed to necessarily, facts and figures.
And I think you just sort of hit the nail on the head there. As you were talking about it, I was like, and you used the phrase case study, and we're all familiar with the phrase case study. And then in my mind, I'm going story. And then you just said, and then you mentioned the story. And for me, it's just like, okay, actually a case study is just a story.
Yeah.
And, even if it's the simple things like, as part of your training, instead of talking about the case study, talk about the story.
Yeah.
And it's just those two words, because case study sounds so corporate.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It's almost, and a case study is often used from a marketing and sales perspective, which in many ways is what we're trying to do when it comes to education awareness or behavior and cultures. We're trying to market stuff to the audience and then influence their behaviors. I used to talk about, influence. People have a choice whether they buy or they don't buy into our beliefs and values around information security as documented in this policy. And my job is to sort of get them to buy it. You get this, you need to have a compelling story, because people will tune into story and even the word story compared to maybe talking about case study when you're talking to an audience. I think within this community for the podcast, it's completely people understand it, but it is a story.
Yeah.
And there was a book I read. I'm trying to remember what it's called now. Wired for Story. And I've been really in the early days of the podcast, I really wanted to get this the author actually on the show, but it's a really interesting book, Wired for Story. And it talks about how our brains are wired for story. And even just talking to somebody and using that story as like, let me tell you a story, okay, it has a reaction with us. And if you can then write a good story, because I think you might know the content, but it's then about writing it, and then it's about delivering it. Sometimes these are different skill set, and it's not necessarily in the same person. You could be more effective with engaging with the audience, I think.
Yeah, totally. And like I say this, when I talked earlier about sort of, blockers, some of the people who have been blockers will say, but if you get some case studies or stories that we can send out to our staff, we're really interested in those. So that, certain people have, they want to learn differently or receive information differently. And, instead of fighting it, getting stories together. But obviously in the industry, it's really difficult sometimes to get really good stories, because a lot of the time, if it's a really big incident or breach, then most tend to try and sweep it under the carpet to hide the horror of what's happened. And I think sometimes that's one of the difficulties we have with, certainly the cyber side of security is, sometimes we don't want to share what's happened because of the scare factor.
Yeah. What it could do to our reputation, if things got out into the public domain.
Yeah.
Which in some cases, legally, they have to get out into the public domain. You think about GDPR, for example, and even in contracts between organisations nowadays, it's very much a case of if you have an incident, then you've got to let us know. You've got to raise our awareness. Once you become aware, you need to make us aware that there's been an incident, but that might not necessarily be in a public way. Yeah,
totally.
Yeah, so getting the story can be hard. Do you think they have to be real stories, or do you think that you can tell, I think about, I've got 2 big books around fairy tales.
Yeah.
Because a long time ago in the Analogies Project, we basically wrote up a series of, I think it was about 20 analogies based between information security and fairy tales.
Right.
And then we shared them within the project. But yeah, does a story have to be actually real for it to be compelling and engaging?
Just from a personal point of view, I would say no. I think the use of what if as a why for people would be really good. But then, you are always going to get the potential question of, did this happen? Because I suppose different people react in different way to what they're being told, isn't it? You're always going to have those people who are quite positive about a message, and some people are going to be quite negative about it. We issue things on an intranet site, and we're really keen to leave the comments box open because we're starting to embrace maybe some comments, whether they be positive or whether they be negative, to actually glean some information about people's thoughts on what messages we're trying to tell. So a few years ago it used to be the keyboard warriors are potentially moaning again, but actually engage in some of these people. You can get some really good information about them, about sometimes about what we're doing wrong and how we're engaging people wrong. Whereas sometimes I often see newsroom articles on our intranet and they turn the comments box off because they think, well, we're going to get hit with loads of negative reaction to this. And it's like, well, let's be brave enough to actually, why don't we listen to our staff? Why don't we leave the comments box open? Now, a bit more difficult, like I say, referring earlier to, certainly where I work, if you post an article on pay, usually it's a negative article on pay, you're going to get lots of comments. But sometimes there's little glimmers of information that should be gleaned.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point because, there's 2 sides to the coin when it comes to awareness. I think most people who are given the responsibility of education and awareness and what's in their job spec and what they're measured against is actually awareness, as in driving awareness amongst a target audience. But I think one of the things that's been really important to me in my work is that actually awareness is it's the 2-way process. How aware are we, those people responsible for awareness, behaviour and culture, how aware are we of our audience?
Yeah, completely.
And I can't remember the exact context of this. Oh, yeah. The old thing about there's a reason why we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth.
Yeah. Listen twice as much and... Yeah,
you listen more than you would talk. You wouldn't believe that for me on this show. But that's the thing, isn't it? There's physically that we're designed that way. So there's a sense of we should be listening. And I do wonder sometimes about how much of what we're measured against as those people responsible for awareness, behaviour and culture, how much of it is actually about how effectively we listen compared to how much we actually engage with. Because a lot of the job specs, we're doing some interesting work at the moment, a piece of research looking at job specifications that we're finding online, which are to do with education awareness. And there is a distinct bias towards awareness as in terms of making people aware, and not much mention in there of how we become self-aware to better deliver the process of making other people aware. That's really quite important. I think is maybe when we think of awareness, are we just seeing it in a relatively small context compared to talking to you, talking to other guests that we have on the show. We need to just be aware of what our market, our audience is, what they're saying to us, and turning off the boxes and not allowing them to comment. Okay, is one way of us not being aware, but also at the same time, it's one way of saying no and closing that relationship down with our target, with the target audience, which is not a healthy thing to do, really.
No, it's not. No, totally. And we should always be looking to find as much out as possible from anything we do. Really, we've got to be open to it. And it does fall back to when I talked and introduced at the start of the show. My background was use of force training, and the officers that are really good listeners never actually used to end up on the ground putting handcuffs on people, because they listened to what was being spoken to. And you see it with clips with use of force. If the really good officers listen to what the person's saying, so they can ascertain what information they need to then send the correct message back, they still put handcuffs on them, but they're stood up doing it compliantly as opposed to uncompliantly on the floor. And it's compliance is a scare word in this industry, because in the sense of culture education awareness team, because we want to be more than just compliance. You see the maturity models that are out there, there's different ones, but compliance is okay. It's a little bit further along than having nothing, but we want to move across to this really whizzy metrics based system. But sometimes compliance is okay. It's a good start point.
Yeah, I think there's something there in terms of how culturally you define compliance.
Yeah.
I mean, it's given a negative connotation, compliance.
Yeah.
But actually, it's there are different upsides to it. Maybe it should be. Maybe we stop sort of the compliance brand is a negative one. Maybe we should be thinking about it in a positive way. I mean, I think the example you gave of the use of force training and putting the handcuffs on, I think it's just really interesting. If you can put handcuffs on somebody whilst you're stood up and not find yourself actually on the ground, okay, it's not, you've got the objective of obviously having to restrain somebody, but you reduce the risk that in the process of falling to the ground, the person being restrained gets injured. And also, the officer doing the arrest, for example, or restraint, gets injured as well. And in that case, by being compliant with the process, it's a good thing, because you're reducing the potential risk of injury to both people.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's the thing with compliance. It's sort of it does get seen negatively, but there is an upside to it. Yeah.
Definitely. It's a case of trying to run before you can walk sometimes. I think we're always trying to jump ahead to this. If we onboard a new department and we want to get them to the metrics-based behavioural change, that's really good, and that's where we ideally want to be. But sometimes it's a case of small steps. Let's get them compliant with the learning first, and then think about the behavioural change maybe a little bit later. I mean, from the offset, ideally, if you've got enough time, then yes, you're going to build in what your aims and objectives from a behaviour point are from the start. And
and I guess as we're sort of getting towards the end of our chat, is there anything that's currently exciting you in terms of how the industry is, I guess, rethinking the challenges that it's facing?
I think there's vendors out there that are looking at exciting technology that may well be able to aid, culture education awareness team deliver. I'm not going to mention any of them, but some of them out there are looking at AI and looking at ways in which we can establish some of the psychological behaviours that people do, the cognitive kind of things that they're doing. I think that's quite exciting, because there's a lot of investment in the space, and I think cyber's a big business, and I think as we're starting to establish that human risk is big, we're starting to see more money go into the development of tools for the human side of the risk. And there's a real chance there to for culture education awareness team to work with a lot of these vendors to implement some of the strategies, and I think that would be a good thing long term.
Yeah, I think that there is a lot going on, and I think what's been healthy to see is that some of the vendors out there actually taking the time to step back and rethink actually what the challenge is before they're actually coming up with solutions. It can be, I think, it's interesting. You sometimes get a sense of solutions then taken to market and then trying to find the opportunity really for where can they fit, rather than understanding what needs to be addressed and then designing things appropriately. So I've seen more of that going on. Okay, look, it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you for sharing your insights. I think the challenges that you faced in your previous environment that you worked in, again, it just comes down to awareness and then, influencing behavior. So, teaching somebody how to actually restrain somebody properly and then actually influence, because it's one thing to teach them, it's another thing for them to put it into practice. Again, it's the same challenges that you face and all our listeners face in terms of, awareness, bringing around changes in behaviour, and then embedding that into an organisational culture. So it's been great to have you on the show. Thank you very much for the time. I hope to bump into you somewhere around the UK in the near future.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce, and thanks for the time.
Absolute pleasure, Neil. Thanks very much for joining us.
Take care. Bye.